All right. Hello and welcome everyone to this online launch of our special issue, Engineering the Middle Classes, State Institutions and the Aspirations of Citizenship, our special issue in Critique of Anthropology. My name is Schubert, and with me are my co-editor, Maxim Bolt, and our contributors who are in running order, Jeff Hughes, Miranda Schild-Johansson, Mark Mikusch, Henrike Donner, and Hadas Weiss, who wrote the afterword, and Natalie Schubitz, who's helping us to manage the Q&A. So before we launch into it, a word of thanks to all our contributors, and I'm very happy that all of you could make it today. Thanks also to the editorial team at Critique, who helped us along the way, and to Allegro Lab, who's hosting and streaming and later hosting the recording of this webinar. And also thanks to all of you who registered to attend and who are here today interested, hopefully, in the topic and the publication. So as I said, the event is being recorded now and should have been live streamed, which might not have worked for technical issues, but will be made available online later on the Allegro Lab platform. So this is what's going to happen today. Max and I will first introduce the special issue, its overarching questions, the key arguments for about 7 minutes or so. And then each of our contributors will talk about their paper in the collection for about 5 minutes each, so that we have enough time to launch into a Q&A with the audience for maximum, I would say, total running time of 90 minutes. So if you have a question for the Q&A, please raise your virtual hand, and in the Q&A, Natalie will unmute you and make you ideally also visible, if that's even possible, when you're up to ask your question, rather than just writing it into the chat, to have at least a semblance of group discussion going on. So thanks again, everyone, for being here, and over to Max to start the introduction.
Thanks, Jon. The middle class has become the subject of euphoric narratives of growth and improving standards of living around the globe. An important perspective on modern states comes from appreciating how they've long made middle classes and in turn been legitimated by them. Modern states, including in the wake of decolonization, required and made strata of employees with professional status distinct from working classes. More recently, middle classes have been depicted as central to liberal states. And states presiding over capitalist economies have defined their success by the growth of consuming classes, even if that sometimes has depended on direct public assistance rather than employment. We don't want to get into important but well-worn debates about definitions of middle classes. Instead, we're interested in how state and middle class interact as sharply normative concepts. Both concepts are not only etic, but also emic, and they're aspirational. So they're key social science concepts, but they also represent interrelated, morally loaded projects of demarcation, distinction, and recognition. One dimension of this relationship is symbolic. In teleologies of progress, middle classes have routinely had legitimating power as vanguards of development. Less obviously, public talk of middle class prominence and growth is politically expedient. If you can portray society as gravitating around a big middle stratum, you can shift attention from more polarized narratives of class conflict, of rich and poor. But that symbolic dimension is not the whole story. How do the aspirational, self-defined social formations of the state and the middle class interact in practice? This isn't a simple question. One way is through influence. This might be directly through public employment, although middle classes span public servants, the independent professions, and the world of work in private companies. Or it might take the form of politics oriented towards what are perceived as active voting blocs. Either way, given their prominence as the educated, credentialed, and officially recognized and employed, it's hardly surprising that members of middle classes are very often able to frame assertions as general moral narratives about state and nation. Even influence is complicated. Middle classes may be political symbols, but they're often politically apathetic. They may represent salaried privilege, but they're frequently precarious with declining spending power and their attempts to accumulate riven by debt. They may benefit disproportionately from state jobs and resources, but many of those states have long been contracting. Moreover, a regular feature of middle-class definition vis-à-vis the state is asserting a degree of distance, whether this is the overt independence of the professions or the equally insistent independence of entrepreneurs or corporate workers in the market. And yet, across a whole range of occupations, the state has a protagonist's role in people's self-defining stories. We underline moralism and aspiration as really crucial dimensions. Even public employment is not just job and income, but the basis for morally charged self-understandings. Those self-understandings are shaped by a concern to remain in the state's good graces, being a good citizen and upholding the correct values of the polity and its economy. States and middle classes are ongoing, incomplete projects of demarcation and legitimation. They depend on everyday practices that are necessarily messy and sometimes fragile, but each relies on the other's apparent solidity and obviousness, and each upholds the other. That solidity involves boundary work, social demarcation on both sides. For people concerned to be included in the middle class, stories of improvement shape performances of distinction, with the result that there's little dignity for those falling from grace through downward mobility. The boundary work of performing credentials, cultural fluency, and taste is especially important for people whose economic circumstances may in fact be fragile or hard to transmit across generations. Among state officials, normative ideas about public institutions set scripts and roles, the very terms of their work, and so also the boundaries of who represents the state and on what terms. Such normative judgments help give the state unified and permanent authority in the messiness of everyday institutional practice. These forms of boundary work are mutually constitutive. Middle-class distinction often relies on a fluency in the language and assumptions of state institutions, bureaucratic concepts, and how to get things done with them. This, in turn, contributes to the impression of coherent, authoritative state institutions in the first place. Often, state institutions are both taken seriously, their dictates observed, and familiar, as middle-class people assume official power to be on their side. Moral narratives lie at the heart of these practices and processes of institutionalization. And over to Jon.
Thank you. So we're really interested in tracking this relationship and how it's negotiated. And this relationship we suggest here is fundamentally characterized by deservingness in very different context-specific shades and variations. And what I mean by this is that they generally have reasons, these middle classes, to trust, not fear, the police and the judiciary, and that the system generally works for them, delivering on its promises and functioning mostly as it was designed to. This remains a powerful fiction, even if in practice, rising costs of living and eroding salaries and social safety nets have eroded the actual benefits that the system delivers to its deserving citizens. So this squeezed middle is often described as the driving force of resurgent populism and nationalism across the global north, and increasingly also in the global south, for example, in India and in Brazil. Moreover, there's very often a racial dimension to this aspect of class stratification based on selective inclusion and exclusion, and this dimension often remains underplayed or unacknowledged in official state policy and presents a more complicated picture in some of our cases, like Bolivia, Mozambique, and South Africa. But the idea of being the deserving middle remains largely unchallenged, with the ideology of meritocracy and social advancement through thrift and decent work conveniently obscuring the inherited class, racial, or other privileges that historically did and often still do make the system work for them. The sentiment of entitlement, however, as we shall see in some of the contributions, sometimes emerges in demarcation from a state that has seemed to have lost its way. Deservingness goes both ways. Middle classes are concerned with their status, their rightful place in society, but the state has to uphold its side of the bargain. regardless of how close, for example, as state functionaries or distant as independent entrepreneurs to the state these middle classes see themselves, a preoccupation with the state and their own relation to it remains a common central concern. As such, the boundary work of sociological theory is not only in relation to elites and the lower classes, but crucially also in relation to the state itself, a relationship that is contested and permanently renegotiated in daily discourse and practice. So our emphasis in the collection illuminates central state institutions, their imaginaries, and their roles in people's lives. Constant renegotiations of proximity and distance allows us to reframe the methodological problem of what exactly is the object of observation. As much as the anthropology of the state has made clear that the state is a fiction, a social artifact, a state effect is no less real because of that. It materializes in the lives of people, but precisely in and through these negotiations, and as we emphasize, it takes shape through evaluative judgment. Similarly, while the middle class often remains vexingly nebulous or reduced to its socioeconomic status, being middle class can often be traced back to very specific mundane interactions with state institutions through which rights, entitlements, status, and aspirations are renegotiated. It is among those individuals and groups in society who articulate a specific claim on their place in society through their special relationship to the state, a claim predicated on the idea of deservingness, that the contours of the middle classes emerge beyond the purely economistic or the fuzzily self-ascribed. And these negotiations are carried out in arenas that are relevant to both sides, central both to modern statecraft and seemingly independent projects of self-making: taxation, property ownership and markets, social reproduction in the home, state employment, professional education, expertise and accreditation, and even the law itself. These arenas are the ethnographic focus in our collection. So rather than focusing on the middle class and their aspirations as such, contributors investigate the role of state institutions, the processes and projects that mediate these aspirations. Although these institutions were often expressly designed to engineer the creation and expansion of a stable middle class, our articles highlight the bricolage and reciprocal nature of this relationship, through which the state and the middle class appear as contingent and always emerging, mutually constitutive projects. Taken together, the contributions to the special issue show how the complex relationship between middle class and state emerge through concrete processes against the horizons of particular policies and models. Aspirations entangle with institutionalized life courses, from schooling and qualification to employment, to marriage, to home ownership, to good death and the passing on of wealth. So even as we reject universalist and heteronormative social science assumptions about societal change and a natural life cycle, how might shared registers, imaginaries, and processes of state and class making undergird the blueprints and schemes aimed at middle class formation? Our emphasis on state projects in building middle classes affords fresh terrain for comparative anthropology. So now we'll just go through the individual contributions for about 5 minutes each. First up is Jeff Hughes. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. My particular contribution was focused on Jordan, where I've been conducting fieldwork and living and working since 2006, which is about, I guess now, almost 17 years. And I was very interested in the phenomenon of marriage. I wrote my dissertation and first book on marriage. And one aspect of this was the changing moral and political and economic status of housewifery in Jordan as part and parcel of, I think, transforming gender roles in the world more broadly. And I think that what was at stake here was really thrown into sharp relief when a recent New York Times profile of Jordan, drawing on some recent World Bank data, christened Jordan as the country with the lowest rate of women's workforce participation of any country on earth not at war. And I think this is a very fascinating factoid for a number of reasons, and I think especially in that historical context, bringing to mind this aspect of bricolage in terms of how the deserving middle classes are constructed as such, because, in through the late 19th and 20th century, it was precisely the ability of a country to basically have such a large, in some ways unproductive population of women living at home that was seen as the hallmark of a prosperous national bourgeoisie. But in the 21st century, increasingly, this becomes a singular signifier of relative abjection and state failure, right? That basically to not have women at work is seen as basically somehow indexing not only those individual women as not members of the middle classes, but their country itself as somehow no longer in that sort of middle income range, but also almost being pushed down into the range of sort of states in a sort of a position of failure. And this was very much reflected on the ground in Jordan as well, right? This wasn't just some sort of international discourse, right? So when I was a Peace Corps volunteer from 2006 to 2008, I was living in this tourist boomtown, and women regularly sort of would tell me that they wanted me to focus particularly on teaching their girls English. It was an all-boys school, but I would do tutoring in the afternoons as part of my work. Because they wanted their daughters to have opportunities that they had never been given. They'd oftentimes not been allowed to complete schooling, and they saw this as very much limiting their opportunities in life. But they also saw this not just as kind of a straightforward economic proposition, but also very much as a moral project, that going to school was part of the sort of the moral education that they wanted their daughters to receive. And you could even tell that this among men as well, right? That there was, I remember one guy in particular who was a principal that I worked with who said, a rabbat bait, as the Arabic word goes, that a housewife, that's what you say, right? It's a good job, right? But you could tell from his tone of voice that even he wasn't totally convinced by what he was saying. And this also came up very much in my research on marriage, where people were talking in hushed tones about how there was this kind of flip in the village from a situation in which not having gone to school was seen as a boon in marital negotiations, making you a more, sort of pure and, eligible, sort of woman, towards the situation in which women who did not have education didn't have employment prospects and therefore were not seen as good marriage prospects. And there was this sort of a concern that certain women were getting kind of caught in that kind of switch in terms of what people were looking for when they got married. So you could possibly see all this as a very new phenomenon, but I was actually kind of, I think partly thanks to a lot of historical work, I was already, kind of suspicious of this, right? So I think Laila Abu-Lughod's work on remaking women really sort of, christens this, kind of study of how notions of femininity and gender in the 19th century come to be transformed. I'll just sort of shout out some other people. Marilyn Booth writes really sort of brilliantly about sort of women's life writing as a genre that sort of explores ideas of new ways of sort of being middle class and of being, sort of a middle class housewife in particular. Also, Rebecca Joubin, Abu Hudayb, Shireen Sakeli's excellent book, Men of Capital, also I think has some really interesting stuff about how gender is being remade in the Middle East in the 19th century. So all of this basically sensitized me to how this particular notion of a sort of a middle-class housewife as indexing a certain kind of political and moral status for the family as a whole and for the society as a whole is really sort of emerges at a particular moment in especially I think the colonial encounter. And it's a way that certain civilizational discourses that are being negotiated between East and West, between the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, are being articulated on the ground. So much for the sort of the background for my own research, but sort of what am I actually contributing here? Well, I could sort of regale you with more and more stories that I heard about how this all came up, but it was really in the archives that a lot of the sort of the state construction of the middle class housewife was really drawn home to me. And I think that for one thing, and I think this has already been studied somewhat well by people like Joseph Massad, who's a sort of a historian of Jordan and Palestine, but there was a sort of a British military trainer by the name of John Bagehot Glubb, who worked really hard to introduce sort of new structures into the military. And part of this was bringing that sort of British idea of gender relations into Jordan, but also in a lot of ways projecting those relationships onto Bedouins and seeing Bedouins, in a sense, as he says at one point, as really being like Mr. and Mrs. Smith from Tooting when you get right down to it in terms of how they relate to each other. So then this becomes sort of a model via the military for how people in the Jordanian national bourgeoisie should act. And this isn't just reflected in, sort of military policy. It also sort of spreads, especially I think after the war, after decolonization, to other aspects of society as well. And one of the main ways that I saw this was when I was doing a study of marriage contracts at Sharia courts, right? So I had collected basically something like 800 or 900 of these contracts spanning from 1926 to 2011. And the change that happens with that sort of switch over the decolonial period is really striking. The concept of housewifery in a marriage contract simply does not exist under the British occupation. It's only after decolonization, and especially in the 1960s and 1970s, that housewifery emerges as basically the dominant category through which women are interpolated into the Sharia courts, right? So basically by the 1980s and 90s, almost every woman who's getting a marriage contract is being defined as a Rabbat Bait, or sort of a housewife, right? And this becomes sort of the major way that these women are sort of understood in relationship both to their husbands, but also in relation to other society. This is also happening in parallel to the abandonment of the concept of falah, or peasant, and the reclassification basically of people who are engaged in various forms of sharecropping as basically free labor, farmers, things like that, but basically sort of obscuring that kind of more feudal traditional labor relation and replacing it with something different. Simultaneously, the woman ceases to be part of a socialist state, and she's given her own sort of occupational category of the housewife. So I think that's one aspect of the story, right? I think that tells it very sort of succinctly, but there's also things happening in the world of property relations as well that are very important to take into account. For instance, traditionally among Bedouin, the woman's trousseau would be the source of the physical house, that goat hair tent. But with the advent of concrete steel rebar housing, increasingly housing, and to a lesser degree land as well, becomes men's wealth. And it's increasingly not just of these sort of amorphous patrilineages, but it's also very carefully delineated to particular senior men. And the same also goes with housing policy. So to kind of bring back sort of the military dimension of this, there's this military housing corporation that's deliberately trying to prevent urbanization. And the World Bank in the 1980s in particular is also very concerned with preventing urbanization as well, and very interested in promoting this model of what they call the individual owner builder, in which a very gendered as masculine figure is responsible for house construction and basically the housing of his entire family. And so this brings me to kind of a profound irony in what I think my story is, right? Is that the precisely what makes Jordan seem backwards in the 19th century, which is the absence of sort of a prosperous national bourgeoisie defined by the presence of all of these housewives, is transmogrified in the 21st century into evidence of its continuing backwardness. So no sooner have Jordanians managed to basically adopt sort of the normative middle class sort of gender roles of sort of the 19th and early 20th century, that those gender roles shift again, and Jordan once again finds itself out of sync, basically sort of pathologized by the New York Times, but also, of course, by the World Bank, which is completely oblivious in its continued administrations to how its own previous policies have actually created a largely suburbanized built environment in which women struggle to make work pay. They struggle to basically get in to get their kids to childcare, and then get to a job, and then get home, all within sort of the amount of time they have their availability, and even more so, of course, when oftentimes they only have one car. Public transportation is often not great, and again, the lack of public housing leaves people often in these very isolated rural areas and unable really to sort of create a situation in which both partners can actually work, thanks again to a lot of these older World Bank policies that were aimed at preventing urbanization and the attendant social chaos that was feared would come with that. So I'm going to just leave it there. I'll kind of turn it back to, there's a lot more detail in the article, and I'm very happy to sort of go into that more in the Q&A, but thank you very much for listening.
Great, thanks very much, Jeff. Next up is Miranda Shield Johansson. Miranda.
Thank you so much, John, and thank you, Max, as well, for organising this today and for pulling together the whole special issue. It was great for me to work on this article because as I was doing fieldwork a few years ago on taxes more broadly in Bolivia, I was mainly working with taxpayers, but I also spent some time in various tax offices, and I came across the fact that it was obvious that the tax office, the Bolivian tax office, has completely rebranded itself over a few years with new logos, new colors, new offices. They'd also adopted a new quality management system. And when they talked about this, their new brand and their new office, they talked about the importance of transparency and accountability as part of the job of the tax office. So I found this very fascinating at the time, but didn't dig into it during that time on my work on taxes. So this gave me an opportunity to look at what I thought, what's going on here with this kind of rebranding and this quality management systems within the tax office. And I think it does relate to producing a new kind of economic behavior amongst the population, and that actually it is about creating middle classes. So my article explores how middle classes are made through tax system and how the Bolivian tax office has worked or are working to create middle class taxpayers and middle class financial behavior. So over the last 15 years or so, Bolivia has actually enjoyed a lot of economic stability and growth. There's more money generally in the country. There's a growing population of urban kind of traders who actually have a fair amount of money. And they are often these are people who self-identify as indigenous and are often called Aymara, the Aymara bourgeoisie or the Aymara popular wealth classes. And so the tax office have realized that they've got this growing population of people making money, but who aren't paying tax. So what my article explores is how the tax office are trying to capture this growing kind of wealthy population and trying to steer their economic behavior towards middle class economic behavior, as well as paying taxes in the first place. So part of this is about obviously collecting more taxes. Bolivia is a rentier state. They rely heavily on taxes brought in by their sale of gas, of their hydrocarbon industry. But they also rely, just like a lot of countries in the global south, on regressive taxes like VAT. Now, regressive taxes and income from hydrocarbon industry, income from any resources, doesn't work within the kind of logics of the IMF and the OECD. It doesn't mark a country as being a progressive country, a wealthy country. What they want to see is income from progressive taxes. That means progressive taxes are taxes which are paid differently according to income level. So for instance, income tax is a classic progressive tax, which Bolivia has hardly any revenue from, unlike VAT, which is a regressive tax where everyone pays the same percentage regardless of income, which a lot of countries in the global south rely on to produce their public services. So the tax office in Bolivia were working to encourage people to pay income tax. So these are independent, self-employed people like the Aymara bourgeoisie to pay income tax on their work. So they were doing this through a range of programs. One was education. They're going into classrooms. They run there's lots of posters all around town, lots of promotional activity, propaganda on the television everywhere. Also this rebranding, which was where I started my investigation, the rebranding of themselves as a particular kind of financial institution that values transparency, accountability, but also a certain kind of temporality. So paying in at certain times, keeping your money in bank accounts where it can be seen and counted, ensuring taxes are paid, but also ensuring taxes are collected in a very regular manner. And then the other thing that the tax office have been doing, and this I think very strategically in order to show to the wider international community that they are in fact not a so-called transitional country, which is how they're being branded at the moment, but a more modern country, which has a kind of a tax profile more akin to European countries, is to try and move self-employed people out of VAT into income tax by actually changing the kind of regimes that are available to enter into if you are a self-employed person. So one of the things that the tax office have been pushing in the last few years is a regime called Régimen Simplificado, where if you are self-employed, instead of paying VAT, you can be VAT exempt and instead pay a presumptive income tax, which is based on the capital you hold. So these are three ways that the tax office in Bolivia are working to kind of try and push different economic behavior amongst the population. But as with all countries, Bolivia has its own set of historical experiences and social structures that feed into their economic choices and logics of taxpayers, such as an oppressive history of oppressive tribute extraction during the colonial and post-colonial period. And this group of people who are being shaped into this new middle class, the Aymara bourgeoisie, according to my research at the moment anyway, we're assisting a lot of this kind of being captured by the tax office. And I argue that this is not just about not wanting to pay tax, because in fact, they pay significant amounts of money into other public pots of money. So for instance, into neighborhood associations, into unions, into kind of pots of money that are shared amongst neighbors or kin, and including ritual kin, in order to create security and insurance across their communities. So there's a tradition of paying towards public goods and of sacrificing significant parts of your salary to do this. However, they resisted paying into the national tax system at the moment. And I argue that partly this is because they were being forced into a system, or they were being asked to join a system that had specific criteria for how you manage your money and how you make money, and that this didn't fit into their own rhythms of money making as traders and exporters and importers. So I think what's really interesting here, and what I'd like to explore more, and what this issue has really helped me look at, is kind of the relationship between, or the parallel relationship really, between middle classes and the state, and taxpayers' subjectivity in the state. And I think they both sit in relationship to the state in a similar way, in that they, just like Jon was saying about, or Max maybe, about this tension between dependence and independence from the state, this need to be able to critique the state, to be independent, to be deserving, but also then this relationship of interdependence that exists, that I think sits the same. I mean, the taxpayer subjectivity might seem, well, that's completely produced by the state, but actually taxpayer subjectivity is a particular kind of positioning vis-a-vis the states, that asks the states to be accountable, but that also legitimize particular kinds of government. So I think that there's something really interesting here about the relationship between taxpayer subjectivity, middle classness, and the state. And that is what my article explores, which you can go and get all the detail from. But thank you so much, Max and Jon, for putting this together. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Miranda. In the order of publication, my article is next, and it's called A Vision for the Future, Professional Ethos as Boundary Work in Mozambique's Public Sector. And a bit like Miranda, this allowed me to revisit some older fieldwork material that I had done in 2016 as part of a broader project on the impact of a natural resource boom and bust cycle on ideas and practices of the state in Mozambique. So it's fieldwork with public functionaries in and around the Ministry of Mineral Resources of Mozambique. And among other things, what struck me in my conversations with my Mozambican interlocutors was a constant preoccupation with professionalism. And this was a notion that was strongly shaped by the country's colonial and socialist periods. And I was struck by how they're changing, and sometimes even adverse, relations with the state, but also with broader transnational frameworks of expertise, made that quest for professional ethics very difficult. So whether they were part of an older generation trained in the East Bloc during Mozambique's socialist period, or part of a cohort of younger, broadly Western educated professionals, made little difference in their understanding of their professional duty towards a national project of development, and how they understood their role within transnational frameworks of knowledge transfer. What had changed with time, however, was their relationship to the state, this imagined vessel of a national narrative of progress, which had changed dramatically in nature from the times of wartime socialism to donor-dependent reconstruction to now extractive neoliberalizing capitalism. And they were seeking to reconcile their professional ethics of working, if you will, for the greater good of the nation with the realities of a context where, in their own view, public interest has been made subservient to the pursuit of individual enrichment. So was a very ambiguous middle position. What happens when the values of probity, diligence, technical expertise, and fairness promoted for example, by state socialism and ideas of international solidarity. This is a sociopolitical project that has now all but disappeared as a global emancipatory reference. What happens when these values now stand in diametrical opposition to the values upheld or enacted by that very same state? So the article illuminates shifting moral, technical, temporal, and social understandings of professionalism through which my interlocutors constructed their relationship to the state and their own perceived role within it. And through this focus on professionalism, I suggest we can chart these constant renegotiations of the ambivalent relationship of educated, salaried state employees to their state. So while these people obviously also demarcate themselves from both the rapacious elite and the poorer, uncultivated popular masses, they constitute their political subjectivities in reference to both a national narrative of progress and to larger transnational frameworks of technical expertise and professional ethos. And what I show is that the boundaries that middle-class state functionaries draw through their professional ethos remain strikingly similar, despite the transition from socialism to capitalism. So emphasizing the historical trajectories of shifting ethics of technical professionalism allows us to track this professional boundary work vis-a-vis the state. So what the article then does is to compare and contrast experiences and discourses of an older generation of functionaries who were raised under different conditions, but under socialism and even earlier under colonialism, with those of a younger generation trained roughly in the West in a capitalist context. But in both cases, respect for hierarchies, virtues of competence, technical knowledge, and professionalism run through both these generations, even though one generation links this to socialism and a party state-led program of national betterment, and the next one associates it with neoliberalism and distance from the ruling party. So the frame of reference that is invoked may have changed between then and now, but some of the boundary work through an affirmation of professional ethos remains strikingly similar across these delineations and scales. Of course, not all middle classes across the globe are drawn from a reservoir of self-described virtuous and technically competent professionals, or that professional ethos is the only register of middle-class boundary work. But I think that the fashioning of professional selves in relation to a national project to which one feels belonging and also entitlement might be in fact a defining key characteristic of middle-class self-making, and that self-making stands in a very ambivalent, constantly renegotiated, dialectic relation to the state that this middle class is the supposed bedrock of. So what the article tries to do is to reconceptualize the middle classes through their relationship with the state, and that of course is always historically grown and contingent on specific contexts. But it is formed in an iterative dialectical process with that state and what the state is supposed to be and do for them and what they represent for this national project. So through this, the middle class emerges as an ethical project that is constantly remade by making claims on this shape-shifting state. So it's available now. Please read it. I'm happy to answer more questions later, and over to Max.
Thanks, Jon. So my article focuses on Johannesburg in South Africa, and it explores how legal training and legal bureaucratic work simultaneously shape racialized middle-class positioning, that of state officials, and shape a state institution itself. In post-apartheid South Africa, the term middle class is, of course, applied across a broad spectrum of people. But central to South Africa's more enduring middle-class formation has been a mostly Black, post-apartheid professional stratum forged through the state. So the article is about the agency, the state agency that administers inheritance. It's known as the Master of the High Court. Public narratives about South Africa's state middle class have tended to emphasize inefficiency and even corruption, but legal bureaucrats' class positioning and professional personae tell another story. Masters officials have their salaries, of course, but they also have a sense of ownership of a transformed state project compared with still white-dominated areas of the private sector. And they require law degrees, so their professional status has the stricter sense of vocational training through higher qualifications. And that means even more in a country that's seen massive attrition and dropout rates in law programs. What I'm especially interested in here is how a legal bureaucratic middle class also makes a professional public system. That raises questions about what the law itself does in practice as it's enacted. The law is performed in bureaucratic encounters, central to state authority, and also shaping the professional status of legal bureaucrats. Indeed, that professional status underpins the very performance of the state. Education is key here. Professional roles and personal prestige together depend on expertise and the training that produced it. And they're the basis for asserting and performing distinction, central to the boundary work of the everyday state and of middle-class status that I spoke about earlier. For state officials, class recognition depends on credentials, occupation, and professional behavior, not wealth. And state authority depends on demarcations of who embodies state institutions and how. Officials' performances of fluency in what Bourdieu called state thinking constitute them as middle-class professionals while creating the state effects of institutional solidity and legitimacy. This matters because the mutual constitution of middle classes and states is historically specific. It would be a mistake to see institutional and professional formation here as somehow generic. In fact, in post-apartheid South Africa, bureaucratic encounters render professional positioning distinctly fragile. Part of that fragility is institutional. Masters officials emphasize expert and sensitive public service, both in public performances that I describe in the article, and this is on TV as well as in community events, and in their everyday work that I follow. Yet in practice, such service means huge backlogs and unremunerated overtime amidst damning public narratives of institutional inefficiency. If the master, the office here, is legally singular, as the institution responsible for inheritance, professional personae become multiple. Clients are unsure what the master actually does, what exactly its officials do in the inheritance process. Officials are addressed as judges or as little more than clerks. In between, they're mediators, counselors, and investigators. Meanwhile, the master lacks capacity to enforce, even as people come in droves, seeking redress and submitting to its mediations and formalities. But all of this fuzziness and the negotiation of it notwithstanding, the post-apartheid fragility of state bureaucratic work goes still further. A new generation of administrators steps into racialized histories of regulation amidst a still disproportionately white private inheritance sector surrounding state administration. That makes formal status from LLBs, so legal qualifications, sometimes with legal practice experience, especially important. Yet even education and training place officials awkwardly. Legally qualified exemplars of middle-class success, in their daily engagements with attorneys, they're civil servants in an underfunded department. Within the department, hierarchy among officials maps onto the perceived value of their law degrees in a sharply unequal and still racialized university landscape, where historically Black universities remain far more marginalized. At the level of everyday practice, such ambivalence characterizes law in legal bureaucratic work and its institution-making and class-making effects. At the master's office, middle-class status is performed then in the very enactment of a professional system, inflected by the racialized positioning of a new generation of officials. For new members of a state middle class, formal qualifications undergird the performance of prestige and everyday roles. Yet this is double-edged. A particular configuration of legal expertise grounded in education and state employment draws boundaries, not only those desired, but also those limiting recognition. The master is positioned between apartheid legacy and post-apartheid potential, between transformation and a still racialized society, and between professional ideal and the possibilities of a more loyally legal world. And Jon, back over to you.
Thanks very much, Max. All right, we have 2 more articles and an afterword. So over to Marek Mikusz.
Yeah, thank you, John, and thank you both of you for organizing this event. I'm delighted to be part of this very exciting and coherent collection. My article looks at mortgage homeownership in Croatia as one axis at which state institutions engineer the middle class. And it stresses what I think is quite complex trajectory of the development of this relationship in Croatia under changing socio-political systems and housing regimes. And I respond to the few existing studies of Eastern European mortgagers and homeowners, which tend to depict them in similar ways as the so-called new middle classes in global South, as people who basically actualize themselves through their ownership of housing and live the middle class lifestyle, also accumulate in middle class ways, and take this subjectivity of kind of exemplar citizens of the new democratic and capitalist society. But I think that these studies tend to ignore the longer kind of genealogy of middle class in Eastern Europe. They tend to see it as something that is wholly new under capitalism. And they also downplay the more ambiguous ways in which middle class mortgage homeownership worked. And this is what I try to express in my title with the phrase new but squeezed. So to kind of summarize my narrative, socialist Yugoslavia had its own form of middle class, which was defined mainly by educational and occupational attributes, and wasn't very explicitly articulated because it didn't really fit the Marxist ideology. So instead of the middle class, the more accepted term at the time was middle stratum. And in general, a stratification view of class was preferred. And I would argue that it has actually still remained dominant in former Yugoslavia, both in academia, in scholarship, but also in kind of popular knowledge. And although owner occupation was still the dominant form of housing tenure in Yugoslavia, the usual association between the middle class and owner occupation was reversed here, because it was in fact public rental housing that was the most prestigious and convenient form of housing, and the middle classes were privileged in accessing this form of housing. So of course, not all middle class people necessarily lived in public rental housing, but probably most people living in public rental housing were actually middle class. And this changed with the transition to capitalism, as nearly all public housing stock was privatized, and owner occupation became not only the most dominant, much more than under socialism, but also the socially normative and preferred housing tenure. A part of this transformation was also financialization of the housing system, reflected, among other developments, in an increasing reliance on mortgages to acquire housing, and this went in hand with rapidly growing housing prices. Credit expansion was the fastest in the 2000s in the run-up to the global financial crisis. And it was in this context that the Croatian middle class, whose notions and social realities were to a great extent inherited from Yugoslav socialism and carried over to post-socialist capitalism, it was in this context that it was coupled with mortgage homeownership. However, I show that at the time of this credit boom, this coupling occurred again in a somewhat implicit and obscure manner, not so much in public discourse as through operations of institutional mechanisms regulating access to mortgage finance and to state housing benefits. So the first of these mechanisms are banks' credit scoring models, which favored borrowers with attributes that overlapped with the attributes of the middle class, in particular, long-term salaried employment and employment in the public sector. The second institutional mechanism were state housing policies, which again tended to favor the highly educated middle-class families in accessing subsidized owner-occupied housing and mortgages, even if the scope of these programs remained quite limited. So actually, you could argue that it was a very strange form of redistribution because these programs were limited and actually ended up helping people who probably didn't need the benefits the most. And at the same time, public discourse, in fact, naturalized this mortgage and housing boom as part of Croatia's transition to capitalist normality, or alternatively as the outcome of the Croatian cultural preference for owner-occupation. It was only after the effects of the global financial crisis reached Croatia and the consequences of rampant predatory lending practices became apparent that the link between mortgage debt and middle-classness became more explicitly and frequently articulated, and it was mainly through the narrative about the declining middle class, which is particularly victimized by over-indebtedness, predatory lending, and the wider economic pressure on living standards. The publicly visible debtors movements, in particular the movement of Swiss franc mortgagers, also contributed to this increased visibility of middle-class mortgage indebtedness. So I think this process illustrates quite well what is described in the introduction to this special issue as an iterative, always incomplete, and quite often contradictory imbrication between the state and the middle class. Although the state in post-socialist Croatia privileged the middle class in accessing the most desirable form of housing in the given context, which is owner-occupied housing, and even furnished extra benefits to selected members of the middle class in accessing housing, this also turned out to be a mixed blessing in many cases and gave rise to a new, more acutely politicized and deserving middle class subjectivities and politics. And I will end here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marek. And so on to our last article in case study, over to Henrike Donner.
Thanks, John, and thanks both John and Max for organizing that. And I'm very happy to see everybody as well, because I didn't have a chance to meet everyone. So great. I hope that the discussion will be very lively. So my paper is kind of bringing it full circle in the sense that we are coming back to a question around gender and middle classness. My paper is based on fieldwork in Calcutta, India, and it addresses the question of what does home ownership do in terms of state-citizen relationships, and how does gender come into it, right? So on the one hand, the paper is tapping into the kind of critique of the narrative about progress and the possibilities of realizing a good life in India that has become very much a narrative that is dominated by neoliberal ideas about subjectivity, but also, of course, market relations, etc., etc. Where the state is enabling aspirational consumerist lifestyles, which are very much associated with middle classness and with middle class home ownership. And I'm not charting that, as Marek has suggested, as it kind of a necessary relationship. I'm charting that as a relationship that is specific to this particular constellation. What I'm trying to focus on in the paper is how particular kinds of domesticities are produced by home ownership. And by the way, home ownership is enabled and understood as a part of citizenship, and the duty of the state to enable that kind of home ownership that in effect then makes the family, in inverted commas, the anchor of individual life projects, which are very much middle class, right? Parallel, but by no means unrelated to kind of the possibilities that the state provides in terms of home ownerships. There's also, of course, the broader rewriting of urban spatial relations that has been analyzed with reference to India in very much detail. Middle-class women have in those projects become very hyper visible as consumers, mostly, not only in the media, but also in discussions around restructuring and what should happen and what should not happen. And they are hailed as emblems of freedom, and the kind of indicators of social change, where citizens within cities, and particularly within metropolitan areas, are reimagined in a very hyper-modern mode. So this is very much part of reimagining urban spaces and an urbanized nation state. These kind of imageries, I would argue, are embedded in specific forms of domesticity. Yeah, there's a huge number of examples that one could cite. I'm just pointing towards advertisements here that very much focus on marital status and motherhood, whilst at the same time reproducing imageries of women against the backdrop of modern middle-class homes. So there's this suggestion that when you have own a home, you're not only modern, you are also reproducing particular kinds of domesticity via the environment that you actually own as this apartment. Normally it's focused on apartments. So the paper charts property citizenship and the discourse on empowering female citizens via particular kinds of state vehicles. There's a lot of literature in India when it comes to education. The paper looks at something different, and that is really home ownership. How do you enable female home ownership, and why is that so important to the Indian nation state? The middle-class woman is normally cast as a dependent on kin. So there's a history of discussions around law and family law in particular in India that feminists have, of course, criticized from the 70s onwards, and often very successfully. And very often the woman is here seen as an individual that exemplifies, Indian middle-class nationhood and its possibilities via the way that she can be an agent of her own life and of her own life course. Increasingly, this is then entangled with ideas around, consumerist lifestyles and citizens as those who are enabled to tap into middle-class lifestyles and consumer styles that are very much linked to all sorts of ideas. John mentioned professionalism that comes up in the paper as well, but there's definitely also the idea of education. There is, with reference to gender, very much the idea of the housewife. At the same time, there is very much the idea of the professional woman. So all of that kind of overlaps, and the home and home ownership become quite central in bringing those discourses together in the actual lives of interlocutors who I talk about and who I talk with. One of the arguments that I'm making is that in the reality of urban middle-class women in India is actually not that many of them, or most of them, are in employment. The reality is that India's urban middle-class employment for women is incredibly low for such an emergent economy, which is something that is very often overlooked, not only by the media, but also by colleagues. And it's very important to see that a lot of the changes that we see with reference to those middle-class women and the organization of those families is related to demographic change, and particular single-child families. So we have now generations of women, 2 generations, I would argue, who have inherited from their parents, whose parents have been heavily invested in them via state vehicles, via educational provision, via loans, etc., etc.
Henrike?
It was the phone that did it.
Henrike? I think your video is still frozen, but I heard your voice somewhere.
No, I think that was Miranda.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that was me, sorry.
Okay.
The telephone call, didn't it?
Yeah.
It's in the middle of a very exciting sentence as well.
All right, let's maybe give Henrike a minute or so to try and log back on.
These calls are sometimes a bit like seances, right? Are you with us? I think I can hear your voice. That's all.
Well, while we wait for Henrike to come back and wrap up what she was presenting about her case study in Calcutta, just let me thank you all again, contributors, for your wonderful and diverse but still very coherent contributions. And let me already introduce our afterward author, Hadas Weiss. It's a privilege to have you and write a comment on this collection. Hadas is the author of this book, We Have Never Been Middle Class. So it's a privilege to have you with us and have you read our stuff and comment on it. And I look forward to not only reading what you already wrote and is published, but hearing you again also react to our papers, and that will then open for the Q&A. Should we still wait for Henrike to come back another minute? Max?
I think maybe let's move to Hadas, and then Henrike can always have another couple of minutes afterwards to wrap up.
I think that is sensible, just not to also use up too much of your time, attendees and panelists. So thanks very much again, Hadas, also for doing this, for joining us. Over to you.
Well, thank you for inviting me to do this. It was a real pleasure to be given the chance to write the afterwords to this exciting collection of articles. What I did in the afterword was zone in on the failures in middle class formation that each of the articles identified, and to explore where they're coming from. I'll be brief because my afterword was too. So my argument was that every capitalist state wants a broad middle class population because the middle class is invested in the material and human capital projects that make the state competitive in a global economy. The problem for the state is that the middle class rightly expects stability and prosperity in return for their investments. States can only deliver in a fragmented and provisional way, and only if their economies grow and prosper. But a capitalist economy grows by exploiting labor power and intensifying its subordination to capital. Since the people who identify themselves as middle class derive most of their income from work, they are themselves the victim of this very condition. It is so even if some of them can also gain some of the fruits of prosperity at the expense of others. So they do so primarily through professionalism and home ownership, which are two dynamics I also look at. In the face of state-promoted ideals of educational and professional meritocracy, as well as mortgage-fueled home ownership, you get a bottom-up boundary work, workers who are also professionals and homeowners trying to protect their relative gains by shutting out strivers and newcomers who threaten the value of their acquisitions. In other words, these state-sponsored forms of material and educational property encourage workers to compete against each other for relative advantages by investing in the very projects that the state organizes, even as the value of these acquisitions derive from the exploitation of work. And so workers fuel capital accumulation at their own collective expense. Professionalism and home ownership provide the most well-positioned and heavily invested among the national workforce with just enough property and credentials for them to envision the security and prosperity that are in fact beyond their reach, and to fear the loss of what privileges their homes and credentials may have helped them attain. The capitalist state thereby remakes a population of exploited workers into a citizenry of fragmented, competing individuals, invested and investing in the resources and institutions that underwrite its economic growth and global competitiveness. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Right, thanks very much, Hadas, and welcome back, Henrike. Sorry to have lost you briefly. Still, after 2.5 years of pandemic teaching, stuff happens. So welcome back, and I hope you can wrap up. But you were cut off in the midst of elaborating a point, and then yeah, things happened. So over to you again for another couple of minutes, and then we'll open up the Q&A.
Okay, the problem is I don't know where I was cut off, so I'm going to try kind of just make sure that it makes sense. Okay, so we're sorry, apologies for this. We are going back to India for a minute or two. So I was talking about home ownership and how actually making gendered homeowners is really very much part of the middle class project in India at the moment. We don't know how long this is going to last, but my special interest is really in the way that this links with broader discourses on women's role as emblems of the nation and the nation's progress, etc., etc. And at the same time, then drilling down onto like what is the actual role of home ownership on the ground. And one of the things that lie kind of in between these two things is the discourse on the empowerment and agency of middle-class women as subjects, right? Which on the one hand is expanded, of course, when you become somebody who becomes also a financial agent in their own rights. And at the same time, you know, home ownership, which is hailed as the ultimate in providing women with security, safety, which are two different things, of course, and actually a residence, which is a big thing in the context of South Asian family making, that they can call their own, right, is at the same time also putting new pressures on them and making middle-class women much more vulnerable than they probably were before. As an aside, it's important to note that not only is employment very, very low in urban South Asian contexts, in particular for middle-class women, so money that is invested in homes is actually acquired via marriage, and it is acquired via your parents. This is a new thing because, of course, parents were not heavily investing in daughters before. And this happens increasingly because there is only one daughter, because of the single child family and the proliferation of that family form, which allows a new younger generation of married women to actually have rights in their homes in their own right. It also makes them into, of course, propertied citizens as an effect of demographic change, I argue. So what I then asked in the paper is, what does this reconfiguration of property and kinship tell us about the role of the state in promoting class formation? Because I'm really interested in class formation. Firstly, that enabling home ownership has become one of the most effective means of governance, and it shapes intimate lives as financialization deepens. Home ownership is a collective effort, as it depends on couples collaborating on kin to chip in and on the ideological construction of the middle class family. As a means of governance, home ownership is present in the way citizens relate to normative notions of the family and to urban space. And I can't remember whether I was already at this point, I apologize if I was. Urban space not only understood as the kind of the actual home, the apartment, but also urban space and urban restructuring more broadly. So leisure activities, all of these kind of things, and the way that they are conceived and planned and worked into, you know, politics of the state. And all of that is envisaged as being enabled by the individual loan and the kind of credit infrastructure that is provided. Secondly, I do think it's interesting to think about this as something that links the situation of middle-class women to that of very poor women, who are also targets of the state in terms of empowering them through financial infrastructures. And I'm focusing in the paper a little bit on the work by colleagues who dealt with microcredit. So microcredit as well, providing women with access to specific kinds of loans, if you so will, in order to enable so-called agency, which is contingent as part of processes of class formation that are very much linked to ideas about being middle class, but you will not be middle class by having microcredit schemes imposed on you, right? So it's measured in terms of middle class things like consumption. I would argue not solely and probably not even primarily women's employment, but kin work as gendered labor enables those kind of property markets and that kind of class formation. And caught betwixt and between are these middle-class women who, as I tried to suggest, are kind of stuck in a liminal state that are enabled to act assertively and develop aspirational spaces in their lives within the context of these extended family ideologies. But as anthropologists and as those who are analyzing that, also have to we have to also kind of see that in the context of broader effective economies of late capitalist class formation, in which gendered labor as kin work plays a crucial role.
Wonderful, thank you, Henrike. I'm glad we got you back. So we're going to open up for the Q&A now. Those in attendance, please raise your virtual hands and we'll allow you to speak. Despite what I said about 2.5 years of pandemic teaching, this is the first time we're hosting an actual webinar in this format. So I think we'll manage. Please, when when you give us your question, tell us to whom it's directed. That will make it easier for us to reply appropriately. And then, of course, amongst us, you panelists, contributors, please feel free to jump in if you feel you'd like to complement what's being said with some from your own paper and experience. So now the floor is yours, attendees. Yes, thanks, Deborah.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, thanks. I don't know that my question's addressed to anyone in particular, but thank you for all your presentations. What I was so struck by was the idea that engineering sounds quite a planned and kind of methodical process, which, you know, the state does this planning and sets out visions of what might be happening. But quite a lot of what you guys were talking about was quite sort of immaterial and quite shifting and sort of fragile and in a whole variety of different ways. We were talking much more about some sort of almost like promise than rather a plan as such. So I just wondered if you could reflect on that and more kind of, well, slightly side question, I suppose, was I wondered whether a lot of cosmopolitan aspiration and desire to reach beyond these kind of parochial national settings also played a role, because in a way the sort of state is often understood as the local state, which is basically kind of structuring everything you do, but maybe there are people here who actually aspiring to be something beyond that state. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thanks, Deborah. Jeff, you seem to want to go first, so.
Yeah, no, I think this is a great question. So I think on the question of engineering, I mean, this I think is a sort of a classic anthropological question, really. We could take it all the way back to Claude Lévi-Strauss and this idea of the bricoleur and the ingénieur. But I always personally thought that Lévi-Strauss was, you know, sort of maybe not really the best authority on what an engineer actually does in their day-to-day job. And I think that when I think anyway of what an engineer actually does, there's a lot of tinkering involved actually. And I know that that's what the bricoleur is supposed to represent in that kind of that classical distinction. But when I kind of take up the term engineering, I think about it much more in that sense of kind of tinkering and the sense that there is a particular project, right? There's a sort of an end goal, right? Oftentimes I think it's defined in terms of state building, stability, right? Prosperity. I mean, these are, I think, kind of vague things. But I think that there is a kind of a teleology to engineering, and I think there is oftentimes a teleology to these, you know, projects of, you know, state-led middle class formation. But oftentimes I think they're very underdetermined in terms of the means by which they're going to get that goal, and I think that's part of why I'm so interested in how the very thing that can kind of, you know, mark you out as middle class in one historical era can make you déclassé, you know, sort of 10, 20 years later, right? I also wanted to kind of comment on your second question, which I think was excellent, which is certainly based on my own sort of work in the Middle East. These discourses of middle class are incredibly transnational. If anything, they arrived to Jordan very late. And that's itself, I think, kind of part of the interesting thing about studying something like middle classness from a more peripheral zone like that. You know, sort of what I see, at least, you know, in the kind of the discourses of middle classes emerging in the Arabic language public sphere in the late 19th century is it's not only about, you know, sort of cosmopolitanism, but it's very much about these civilizational discourses, right? So it's about how, you know, at first, it's sort of a confessionally diverse group of, you know, sort of Muslims and Christians are going to try and create a kind of an authentic, you know, sort of Arab identity that is neither, you know, sort of the impoverished masses nor the kind of the comprador, you know, sort of corrupted, you know, kind of by, you know, kind of colonial complicity, but somehow is going to kind of take the best of both worlds, right? And I think that that's something that comes up a lot in this really exciting kind of global middle classes literature. Certainly, I think I saw a lot of, you know, sort of resonances with Lentz's work on that regard, in kind of looking at the African case.
I'll step in with my response and thoughts next. Thanks, Deborah. Yeah, I think there's something really interesting here about the engineering and what's the point of it. So obviously there's stuff that doesn't happen or engineering doesn't work out. But I think in terms of my work, one of the things I realized was that showing that you have a plan, whether or not that plan works out, counts. So for the Bolivian tax office and the Bolivian government, showing on an international scene that you have a plan to ensure different kinds of tax revenue coming in, it kind of counts as well, even though that plan doesn't work out in the end. So I think there's something about, you know, all the things that happened even when they're not engineered, or how engineering fails, but also the value of pretending you're engineering something or looking like you are engineering something on an international stage that matters to these relationships. And also in terms of the cosmopolitanism, I mean, this is really fascinating. And a lot of my research participants who suddenly have access to all this money are definitely looking beyond the local state about how to use it. And I was talking before about, you know, neighborhood associations and all these local things, but in terms of their cosmopolitanism, their desire is linked to these export relationships and import relationships they have with, for instance, China. So they value, you know, fake goods from China above branded goods that the traditional middle class of Bolivia value. So there's different kinds of cosmopolitanism that's drawn on this, which isn't recognized by the more traditional Bolivian middle classes, or even by state employees who are looking for the signs of that middle class growing as middle class cosmopolitanism. So it's quite interesting what kind of cosmopolitanism is taking place, or what desires are wrapped up in this in different, you know, groups who are meant to be middle class or not.
Deborah, I'll have a quick go at the engineering question. I mean, but very briefly on the cosmopolitanism, at the sort of at the top end of the hierarchy, some legal bureaucrats I worked with had connections, relatives abroad, kind of horizons that extended beyond South Africa. But that was really at the sort of top end, which correlated with the most elite university educations within the kind of within the range that I described earlier. But most the kind of cosmopolitan frames that you're suggesting weren't really particularly in view. But on the engineering question, yeah, is really interesting. I mean, at the level of the whole collection, I mean, I agree with others. There's kind of what thinking about plans does for how you think beyond them. There's a kind of a provocation already in that. And then there's also the kind of a third term beyond kind of plan versus mess and bricolage and so on, not that they're the same thing, is horizon, is the kind of broad imaginative landscape against which forms of planning and tinkering are all happening. And so just to kind of add that, in relation to my own paper on, I mean, the engineering in my case is fairly explicit in the sense that aspects of the administrative state were, of course, quite explicitly rethought at the end of apartheid, and so were questions of who was supposed to staff it. That said, aspects of the change were sometimes more tinkering than, generally more tinkering than total rethinking. And certainly that was the case with how parts of the law and administrative process worked. And so one thing that I didn't, I think, evoke enough in my short summary was that one of the ambivalences that the legal bureaucrats I worked with in inheritance that they faced was that they were explicitly part of a sea change in who was supposed to be staffing a system, that the ethos of that system was supposed to be totally different as a post-apartheid, not an apartheid, obviously, engine of government. And yet officials felt themselves to be representing processes that were dated, that were often in Afrikaans and English, or English and Afrikaans before any other languages, that were heavy-handed in ways that were inaccessible to most people. And so they were both officially representing those, and their status depended on representing that system, although they saw it as ill-suited to the majority of citizens, and they were caught in between this. And so the engineering there is kind of in view precisely because of a whole load of things that fall out of attempts to create change, and a whole load of unintended consequences.
I'll keep it very brief and just pick up on the cosmopolitanism, because I think that's a really, to me, fascinating part of the story in my material that made me want to revisit this, is that people spoke of this larger frame of reference that allowed them to escape, if you will, the confines of the national project. And if you think back of the people who led the independence struggle in Mozambique, those were already, although they cast themselves afterwards in socialist terms as representatives of the people, were the few privileged African Black Mozambicans who were allowed to study in Portuguese and then also in Portugal in higher education schools or abroad. And this then in socialism kind of continues, where people are trained in Ukraine or in East Germany, and reminisce about that very fondly, because it allowed them to kind of tap into a larger repertoire of social aspiration that the post-colonial and socialist state did not allow for. And so these circuits of expertise, of formation, of what it means to be a middle-class professional, that transcend the boundaries of the nation state, those to me, I think, were very fascinating and also quite central in the analysis I was trying to make, but I'll leave it at that for now.
I wanted to comment very quickly on the question about engineering, and I would agree that there is a good point about these processes not always being necessarily planned, and I think that the way in which mortgage home ownership expanded in Croatia is a good example of that, because the state pretty much let the private sector lead this process, and there was a vague assumption, I think, that this would just work out fine. But at the same time, the state had an ambition to offset this process to some extent by, on the one hand, creating certain privileged categories of people receiving housing benefits, and on the other hand, trying to extend the reach of crediting even more by supporting people who wouldn't necessarily get commercial credit to get subsidized credit. But what I think we can definitely see in the case of Croatia is a movement towards this idea of engineering in responses to the failures of these processes, and also in political discourse. In 2010s, you see more statements about how the state or politicians need to build up the kind of middle class that Germany has, and expand the middle class and so forth, right? So it's also sometimes in response to the failures that this discourse may emerge as more explicit, I would say.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, we have a question in the Q&A in writing. Maybe, Jeff, could you read it out before you answer it for the benefit of everyone? Thank you.
Yeah. So this is a question about my work on this idea of the Robot Beit, or the sort of the housewife in an Arabic-speaking context. And Sana wants to know about the role of the Jordanian royalty and state feminism as espoused by it in consolidating the identity of the national bourgeoisie. So I can go on at length about the Jordanian royal family and how they can play into all this. It's a fascinating story. The previous king of Jordan actually married a British woman at one point, Queen Noor, and then an American woman. He had a number of wives over the course of his life. And then the more recent king has been married to a Palestinian woman by the name of Queen Rania. And there is actually, I think, an interesting shift in how she has positioned herself in keeping with this tradition of having a sort of, I think, a very public, almost first lady-like figure in Jordan as the queen, and how this, I think, is, kind of tied up with these kind of shifting notions of, middle classness, and especially women's public display as part and parcel of certain national discourses of development, right? So Queen Rania herself is very sort of, I think, well known in certain circles for her work on women's empowerment. And I think that her public role in society and her charitable work in some ways is, I think, very much in keeping with, I think that older, almost Victorian tradition of especially, I think, elite women engaging in public service, right? But I think also, right, because of her very active and vocal, sort of advocacy around women's education and women having a place in the workforce and women's rights more generally, that she does, I think, kind of represent how there is, I think, a sort of a very much a sort of an ideological from the monarchy on down sort of dimension to this whole project, right? And I think that this is particularly ironic in keeping with the way that the World Bank and other sort of development groups oftentimes want to frame Jordan's issues around gender and inclusion in employment as a sort of quote unquote cultural issue. I don't want to sort of downplay the fact that there obviously is sexism and misogyny in Jordanian society, but I think oftentimes, there's this tendency to kind of offload it onto this kind of very, kind of amorphous culture talk, when in fact there is a lot of ways in which the pillars of the society are very much in keeping with this much more global, kind of discourse around, sort of women's workforce participation as being increasingly central to the identity of the middle class, not just sort of very logistically in terms of even having enough money to sort of support a middle class lifestyle, but also I think in terms of that more kind of moral and sort of value laden idea of what makes someone middle class in terms of participating in the national project. So hopefully that goes some way towards bringing that a little bit into it, and also circling back to my kind of frustration with how culture talk in discussions of gender, I think oftentimes does cover up a lot of the infrastructural and political economic challenges that are very much part of the picture as well.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I briefly saw another raised hand earlier. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to ask a question or raise a point.
Since I haven't,
Hi, Frank.
Hello. Yeah, just a sort of quick question. Obviously, sort of some of the negativities of this involvement have been mentioned. Do you see the state as perhaps unaware of some of the negativities of this financialization and kind of change of society, and perhaps sort of leaning too heavily on international kind of transnational discourses, essentially sort of led from afar, and sort of perhaps blindly putting these changes upon its population? Is there sort of do the middle class obviously need to perhaps fight back more? Do you see this as a sort of common theme? Obviously a lot of mixed blessings was mentioned, and SIN, I believe in Bolivia, the SIN organization, a funny name itself, but I was just sort of suggesting, do you feel the state on another level has needs to be sort of is blind perhaps some of these negativities? Do you hear me?
Hadas, do you want to have a go?
Sure. I'm a bit uncomfortable. I mean, in my book on the middle class, I don't talk much about the state. I talk more about capital because I see it as a very much a capital-driven process. But here, I mean, afterward, I was challenged to think about the state more specifically. But I emphasize the capitalist state because I think it still is subordinate to capital. And insofar as it is, I think the mission, what the state tries to do is to facilitate accumulation, be competitive in the global economy, and ways in which it does so. I mean, I mentioned institutions, systems like home ownership and professionalism are ways that help. The middle class I wouldn't see it as a deliberate state project, as the way that institutions and systems like home ownership or professionalism is. But it is definitely an international discourse that people who are essentially workers, because most of their salary comes from work, most of their income comes from work, and if their income from work ceased, their life standards would be reduced quite significantly, but still have some assets, intellectual, human capital assets like a professional degree, credentials, and perhaps a home, an indebted home in most cases, call themselves or identify themselves, or have learned to identify themselves as middle class in a way that makes them, their subjectivity or their self-identity somewhat distanced from a working class. That is very much a boon to capitalist states. Capitalist states love that and court the middle classes and try to make everyone see themselves as middle classes, because it has great ideological advantages. It makes people who are, again, essentially workers not see themselves as workers, not see themselves as exploited, but see themselves as an investing population, as a population whose fate is in its own hands, and hence whose losses are their own fault or their own doing, and then somehow identified with these great state projects. So from the point of view of the state, I think the middle class is an unadulterated good, for sure. But then people who identify themselves as middle class, well, they suffer all of the consequences of accumulation as far as they are workers, except that they don't see it, and then they don't organize as workers, and if they're fragmented as various agents of the middle class.
Enrique.
Yeah, thanks, Hades. I think that is kind of a very good framework to work with when we think through that question of the directedness of those kind of developments. But I also think what is very interesting, at least for anthropologists, is to think about the ruptures in that kind of discourse and in those processes. And definitely in India, on the one hand, there is this embrace of, let's say, the financialization of personal lives, because, loans provide opportunities. On the other hand, of course, there are particular areas where people get increasingly frustrated by the fact that these supposedly state assets are no longer really just state assets. And one of the arenas that is emerging now as a tense point is loans for going to university. India has, of course, a large number of state-run universities, which used to be almost free for those who could afford it. They were bastions of making the middle classes and middle classness. And now a lot of people are encouraged, forced, whatever you want to call it, to invest and take out loans in certificates and in kind of, university education broadly conceived, that they think they should not have to pay for and not to take loans out for. And I'm kind of watching that from afar with great interest, because I do think there can be a lot of tension coming out in the process of this kind of financialization of higher education in that way.
Hi, I can just jump in as well, since you brought up STIN, or Servicio Impuestos Nacionales, so it's a little acronym for the tax office in Bolivia. Because I think, it's like both Hades and Enrique says, this is a complex thing, and there are plenty of voters in Bolivia who want the state to get better sovereign credit ratings in order to act better on the international bond markets. They want Bolivia to have a reputation, a different kind of financial reputation and internationally, for their businesses or for their sense of own middle class desires maybe, but also and also plenty of people who want the tax office to collect more tax from other people. So it's not so straight. And the Bolivian tax office have invested a fair amount in public services. It is a left-wing government that, although they are part of international discourses of middle classness, have also done a lot to redistribute goods and redraw contracts with foreign extractors in terms of how much tax for instance, Brazilian gas companies pay the Bolivian state, and they've invested this in universal pension schemes and things. So there, you know, the state is acting in multiple different ways, and I think the Bolivian state has tried to square not just one circle, but many circles. So it's not a straightforward thing about how you know, a middle class identity is being imposed by institutions. There's a lot of different things going on between the relationship the state and how middle classness is used, and how a lot of people are asking for middle classness to be promoted and used as well, a lot of voters. So it's yeah, it goes in many directions. But what is interesting is, I think, how the trope and ideas about middle classness is being used by multiple actors, the state we're looking at in this case, but in order to achieve certain things. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much to all of you. Marek, unfortunately, already had to go. We're about at the end, a bit over time, but we might have flexibility for another burning question if there is one.
We could also let people go and have their lunch. We're very grateful for all of you coming. Obviously, presenters, contributors to the issue. Jon and Allegra, thanks very much for putting this on as well. And yeah, attendees, thank you for listening, for participating, for sticking it out. It's been a fantastic, but also quite long discussion now. So thank you, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Bye then. Thanks, everyone.